Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about a topic that I find personally very, very interesting. It is a topic that I think has very significant reverberations for us in our present life. And indeed, one of the truisms about history is that it is a topic that is supposed to not just tell us about what happened in the past, but it is a conduit through which that we should begin to understand how to address issues in contemporary society. And one of the realities of contemporary society is that issues of race, racism, racial tensions are still very much at an apex. I know that if we talk to a lot of folks, there's conversations about, we've progressed and we've moved forward with respects to race relations. And indeed, there's been a lot of positive changes to take place over the course of U.S. history, but there's still a lot to be done. And when we talk about race theories, and the institution of slavery within the United States, what became known as the peculiar institution, we have to recognize that that institution, although it ended in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, and although slavery itself is no longer a legal viable institution, we are still living with its legacy. And so what I want to do this week is just sort of broadly speak about slavery. And we've obviously talked about slavery in this class already. I don't think it's possible to talk about U.S. history without sort of centralizing that narrative. But we're going to broaden it this week a little bit to look not just at the institution of slavery, but sort of look at some of the racial theories that developed to justify the institution of slavery. There's a few books I'm going to be showing you today, not because they're required readings, but if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely encourage you to read through them. There's a lot of great works out there, but these are just a handful of things. One of the most current resources on this topic is a book called Stamped from the Beginning, and it's the definitive history of racist ideas in America. You're actually going to get a little bit of information on this book today from the author himself. There's a video that you'll be looking at. But this particular text is phenomenal because it tells you the history of the United States through the conduit of racial theories. And there's always been, well, I don't want to say always, but ever since the transatlantic slave trade came into existence, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but ever since that institution was created, and ever since there was a great demand for slaves, there was a subsequent move to create ideas and policies that would then be used to justify the institution of slavery specifically and white supremacy generally. Many of these ideas were rooted in biological differences. There was these pseudosciences, folks that would try to come up with anatomical explanations about how there were different species of humanity, that we all weren't of one particular species, but rather white people were one thing and black people were a different thing. And they would argue that they were polygenesis. There was multiple species of people. And at the top of that was the European species, the white species. And at the bottom would be the African species. And they would use these type of pseudoscientific practices, something we might call phrenology, for example, where they would look at the gait of the head and they would try to figure out various anatomical differences. In fact, numerous images were taken of slaves to try and find anatomical differences. And quite frequently, white folks would talk about how Africans were over-sexualized. They would repeatedly speak about genitalia and that it's bigger, it's smaller, whatever, all to try to make justifications for why black people were allegedly inferior, right? And so you have kind of these pseudoscientific theories. You also have biblical rationalizations. Quite frequently, folks who would participate in slavery would utilize the Bible to try and justify their institution. Of course, the Bible being the foundational moral guide of 19th century America. If you can point to the scriptures and see where God condones slavery, if in fact that was true, it's not, but they would argue that it was, then you can't really challenge slavery as an institution, because if God was cool with it, then, therefore it's okay. And some folks would make arguments like, in the book of Genesis, Abraham had servants. In fact, it uses the word servant, not slave. And so therefore they would argue that if Abraham was God's chosen servant, or if Abraham was God's chosen individual and he had servants, then therefore slavery is justifiable. One of the big problems, of course, with those types of arguments is that slavery is not a brand new institution. Slavery has existed throughout the world in many different civilizations and societies. And the thing of it is that slavery in the United States developed upon very unique and distinct lines. That's why we call it the peculiar institution. The type of slavery that existed in the United States was somewhat different, right? In other parts of the world, you didn't have this system where if your mom was a slave and you were born to a slave, you therefore became a slave. That was somewhat unique to the American experience. And in fact, very grossly, the laws in many of the colonies early on were actually changed so that the lineage of a slave was found through its mother as opposed to its father. Traditionally speaking, heritage was found through the father's bloodline, but slaveholders changed the law in various states, Virginia, for example, so that the bloodline would be traveled or linked back to the mother. And here's the sickening reason, or at least one of the sickening reasons why this happened. If a slave master were to rape his slave, and that was very common, and we need to understand that the violence, the rape, it's all intentional. And it's all used as a technology of control to subvert a people group, to try to convince them and habitually place them into a position of inferiority so that you could therefore then justify an institution of slavery, right? And so we got to understand that that's part of this system of technology of control that's happening here. But if a white master were to rape their slave and they were to father a child, what you did not want to do was to have the law protect that child as being now the master's child. So what you do is you change the law so that any person born of a female who is a slave, that child will now become a slave, right? And of course, one of the things that does is it encourages rape. It encourages sexual violence. And make no mistake of it, following the eradication of slavery, sexual violence did not end. Rape was a very, very powerful tool used by white folks throughout the South and in other parts of the country to try and keep black people in a state of subservience, right? So we need to understand that. There were also legal arguments and justifications for keeping folks in slavery. There was, of course, the presumption, or it wasn't a presumption, it actually was legally protected according to the Constitution at the time. It's not any longer, but it was then. But the idea that you could not prohibit slavery into new states that were created because that would violate the Fifth Amendment protection to property. And one of the things you have to understand is that slaves were regarded as property. They were chattel, okay? And in fact, they would have been treated in such a way that they would have been classified in the same way as your pig or your cow, right? You could no more deny someone take their pig with them from point A to point B than you could deny them taking their slaves. And this is just a handful of theories as to how folks came to try to justify this horrific, horrendous institution. And as John Green will state in a video later, just when you think that slavery wasn't that bad, it turns out that it was that much worse. Slavery in the United States was deeply, deeply problematic. And really what you find out of the institution of slavery is not just a horrific institution, but underneath all of that are the ideas of race and racism, right? It's not as if we would say that prejudice didn't exist before the institution of slavery. Prejudice clearly existed. All you have to do is take a look at the history of humanity to realize that prejudice exists. But one of the things that I've come to believe and I've come to conclude is that our current ideas and conceptions of what race is began to develop with the formation of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the things that most scholars have come to conclude is that race is not biologically determined, rather it is a social construction. In other words, there is nothing systematically, fundamentally different from one person, whether they're Asian or Hispanic or Middle Eastern or black or white. There's nothing fundamentally different from these groups of people. We have far more in common than we have differences. And so when we talk about race, what we're really referring to is a social construction, right? And throughout the United States, one of the things that you need to be aware of that I think is really profound is that when you think about U.S. history specifically, because that's what we're looking at, one of the things that becomes that needs to become apparent to us is this idea known as normative whiteness. Normative whiteness is the idea that which is normal is white, and that which is not normal needs to be explained. Paul Spickard speaks about this in his book, Almost All Aliens. But the idea is that if you are a white heterosexual male throughout most of U.S. history, then that's normal. If you're not that, then we need to explain your difference. And the problem with this is that it suggests that white people don't have race, and that's not true. The way I sort of describe this is no one ever says that George Washington was the first white president. We just assume he's white. Then we get Barack Obama, who was outside the traditional norm of white folks. So what we say is that Barack Obama was the first black president, which of course reinforces the dangerous stereotype that Barack Obama has race and George Washington doesn't. Now, I say all of that as a way to sort of get us thinking about race theory and race justifications and racial tension throughout U.S. history, but also because many of these things spill over into contemporary society. Now, with that stated, some of the historical information that we're going to look at today is going to start with the transatlantic slave trade, or also known as the triangular trade. The triangular trade really begins in the 15th century. I'm not sure if the Portuguese were the very first to do this or engage in this process, but they were one of the first to really move down into West Africa during the so-called Age of Exploration, and there they set up various trade routes. And ultimately what happens is as colonization throughout the rest of the world begins to unfold, a demand for labor begins to intensify, right? Think about Jamestown and the need to cultivate tobacco, right? After indentured servants were no longer a viable option, what you do is you turn to this trade in slaves, and you begin to write laws which would codify what a slave was. I mean, that's the one big thing that has to change, particularly during the colonial era, is you have to delineate the difference between an indentured servant and a slave. If you don't write a code of law making those differences clear, then oftentimes the word indentured servant and slave could be very fluid and interchangeable. That's why many laws get created as a means of codifying who these folks are. But the triangular trade was deeply, deeply problematic and deeply inhumane. Another really key book that you might want to read on slavery, it's a book called Saltwater Slavery. It's by Stephanie Smallwood, and it's called A Middle Passage from Africa to American Diaspora. But one of the things that she makes very clear is that within the triangular trade, one of the things that happens is that folks who are moved from West Africa into the colonies, wherever they happen to go, the second leg of the journey, known as the Middle Passage, that process of transporting folks from point A to point B was a deeply troubling part of the whole process, because it didn't just move people from one place to the next. What it also did was it served to commodify human beings. And what I want you to do is to really think about what that means, right? You go to the store and you look at product X, Y, and Z, and your idea is, how much does this cost? What's the property, or, what's the value of this commodity? That's what the Middle Passage of the triangular trade does. It transformed people who once had thriving cultures individual identities, names, and families, and it transforms them into a piece of property to be bought and sold for whatever purpose the master wanted. It is a deeply problematic process. And the way in which you commodify a human being is you begin to look at them not as individual people, but as numbers. Of course, when we talk about slave ships, folks have to be packed onto slave ships, right, and brought over. They begin to be a cost-benefit analysis as opposed to an individual. You would see folks being branded and their heads shaved and their whole identity removed so that they could be bought and sold. Now, once they were, life for slaves in the Americas was horrifying. And one of the things that I think we need to make very, very clear right off the get-go here is that slaves resisted their enslavement. And this is important to understand because all too frequently, and again, John Green makes note of this, all too frequently we talk about people throughout history as not acting upon their own plot line. In other words, too frequently we think of slaves as just, history acted upon them. They didn't act upon history. And the problem with that is the premise that too many people have tried to justify slavery, at least during the time that it existed. Too many people attempted to justify slavery by making this argument. The slaves liked being slaves. They benefited from being slaves. They benefited from being next to white folks. I mean, that's an asinine argument. But if today we don't recognize that slaves resisted their enslavement, then we run the risk of reinforcing that dangerous stereotype that slaves simply accepted their condition. Now, we may not come right out and say that, but unless we powerfully force ourselves against that narrative, where we run the risk of reinforcing it. But slaves did resist. Oftentimes they resisted with violent outbreaks, but more often than not, they did more of, not so obvious forms of resistance. They might pretend not to understand instructions. They might, if they got pregnant, for example, they might abort the baby. They might try to extort freedom for themselves or their children if they were raped by a white master. They might destroy tools. I mean, there's various ways that slaves might resist. But here's the truism, is that outright rebellion was not necessarily always going to be beneficial. Most rebellions, you think of Nat Turner's rebellion and other rebellions of the same kind, they ultimately didn't result in slaves being freed. Instead, what it resulted in was their death and the death or the selling of their families. We refer to this as pedagogical violence. Pedagogical violence is the idea that, I hurt one or two of your people, so you're going to come back and hurt 50 or 60 of mine. It's a way of teaching a lesson very violently, right? And slavery was violent. And so this week, what we're going to do is we're really going to kind of sort of look through this process. What was it like to be a slave? What were some of the theories used to justify the institution? And I could go on and on and on. I've already gone over my time here. But the last thing I do want to make mention to you is this book right here. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. It's by Edward Baptist. And one of the things I will leave you here with is his central argument that slavery was central to the American experience. It wasn't an off sort of thing. Slavery, as horrifying as it was supported by folks in the North and the South. One of the problems that I think we have in American history today, and it's becoming less and less, but all too often we have this binary where we think that those in the North were abolitionists and they wanted to see the institution of slavery go away. And the reality is that many in the North benefited from slavery. I made mention of that in a lecture earlier before. But we also have to recognize that not everyone in the North was not racist. Many folks were deeply racist. Many folks didn't want slavery to expand because they didn't want to be around black people. They didn't want to economically have to compete with the institution of slavery. Oftentimes, when folks didn't want slavery to expand, it had nothing to do with a moral outrage against the institution. It had to do with other things. I mean, you can think of people like the Free Soil Party. They didn't want slavery to extend, but that wasn't because they were not racist. Okay? All right, I could go on and on and on about this, but I don't want to turn this into an hour lecture, so I've already gone over 20 minutes. I apologize for that. But if you have more questions on this, I'm happy to get into this and talk more deeply about this. It's a topic I'm deeply passionate about, but we need to address some of these issues. So if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.